Welcome to Fast Politics, James.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we were on TV together this week where you were talking and then I was sort of reacting to what you said. And your state rep from Texas, possibly maybe open to running for the the actual Senate as opposed to the state Senate in Texas. And one of the things you talked about, which is like one of my peccadillos, one of my obsessions, is you talked about how you have to go everywhere, that you will not get in front of Rogan's people unless you go on Joe Rogan.
Right.
So I would love you to just explain that more and sort of expand.
Yeah. I mean, I think the last election should be a wake-up call for the Democratic Party. And I think it should push us to get outside of our comfort zone, outside of our bubbles, and start to go places that we don't typically go and talk to people we don't typically talk to, because that's the only way we can build a big enough tent, a big enough coalition to transform this state and this country. I mean, Vice President Harris lost to President Trump by a point and a half, which is a close election. But we should never be that close to
Mhm.
losing or beating Donald Trump. We should be beating him with 60% of the vote. That's the kind of coalition I want to build. A New Deal sized coalition, a Great Society sized coalition, like we had with another Texas Democrat, Lyndon Johnson. So that's, I think, should be our goal as a party, not to just squeak by in the
Right.
next election. We need to completely change our politics so that we can gain political power and remake this broken political system so it can actually work for people again.
So one of the things that when you get in front of, I would love you to talk about like getting on Joe Rogan
Yeah.
and how that, I want you to talk us through the whole thing because Harris did not break through. Like she did an amazing job for being someone with 100 days. She really did do a great job, but she could not break through. And we saw that because there were all these Google searches on election day, who is running for president. So that means they didn't know who was running for president on the Democratic side. So they didn't see it, right? They're not reading the New York Times.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the moments in the campaign where the American people heard directly from Vice President Harris were some of her best moments, right?
Yeah.
The debate, the convention speech. I mean, you can always Monday morning quarterback this stuff, but I think if Vice President Harris had been on Joe Rogan,
Yeah.
I think she might have won the election. That's how much faith I have in her
Mm.
as a person, as a leader. I think if someone hears directly from Donald Trump and hears directly from Vice President Harris, I think it's a clear choice. The problem is they didn't always hear directly from her. There were those moments, but in this day and age, you've got to be talking to people directly all the time,
Yeah.
and you can't just do it at the big, peaks of a campaign like a debate or a convention. It's got to be the whole way through, and that's what President Trump was doing, and I do think it's why he won. But I don't think that had to be the result, and so I'm
Yeah.
trying to learn from those mistakes, and I'm trying to put myself in sometimes uncomfortable positions, right? I mean, to answer your question about Joe Rogan, his team emailed us out of the blue and said that Joe had seen a video of mine and would love to have me on. That was it. There was no list of questions, no list of topics.
Right.
Didn't even know how long it was going to go. Didn't know if I was going to get a bathroom break. Like I didn't know any of this stuff, and so I was flying blind, and that
So
is
you
scary.
just so he's in Austin and you just went
Yes,
into his studio
that's
and
right. Yep, very nondescript. You would not have thought when you were outside the office that it was the biggest podcast in the country. His team was very chill and very nonchalant,
yeah.
kind of like he is, and he was very warm, very curious, very open. I think he and I really hit it off and created a connection. We obviously don't see eye to eye on everything, but there was a lot of common ground, right? He thinks this political system is corrupt. I absolutely agree with that. He thinks that both political parties are flawed and need to change. I completely agree with that. He thinks that there should be a more shared prosperity in this country. He
Right.
believes in universal health
It's a
care.
populist.
Right. Yeah. And those are all things that I believe in too. So that's a lot to build off of. So, I thought it was a little nerve wracking to go into not the most friendly of places and have an open ended conversation for 2.5 hours with no set list of questions or topics. But it requires some courage from our elected leaders to put yourself in those positions. And I do think that you get points for that. You may not say everything perfectly. You may flub a little bit. You may make a mistake, and that's okay. People would rather just hear from you directly, hear
Yeah.
your honest opinions. And I think you can't worry about having a gaffe here and there. That's going to happen. Donald Trump has gaffes all the time, but people hear from him. They hear the honesty, or what they perceive as honesty, and it works. And so we've got to do that on our side. We've got to be ourselves. We got to speak directly, and we got to be everywhere, talking to everyone.
I would love you to tell us what it was like after you went on Joe Rogan. Like what was did your life change? Because this is the thing that I want to get out. I want to get people understanding is that part of the siloed media means that you only get if you're doing certain media, which I work for, you will only get in front of certain people, which is great. There's, a
Right.
lot of very smart people watch MSNBC, a
Yeah.
lot of very smart, but you, in order to win at the national level, you also have to get in front of all different people. So
Right.
tell me what happened
Yeah.
after doing Joe Rogan?
Well, yeah, like right on this show, I'm talking to folks who are already in our coalition.
Yeah,
And that's important because
yeah,
we've got to get our act together if we're going
yeah,
to start winning political power and making people's lives better. So
yeah,
sometimes we have to have locker room talks with our team, which, you do on MSNBC or you do here, and that's super important. But then if you want to actually go out there and build that big tent, you've got to go on Joe Rogan. You've got to go on Fox News, which I've done. You've got to go on the Christian Broadcasting Network, which I've done. And those places are sometimes less friendly, and that's okay. That's part of the job of being an elected official is having that courage to go into those places. But the response has been overwhelming. I mean, in some ways, I think it was just a podcast, but in other ways, people are acting like it was some kind of Democratic moon landing, right? Like
right.
one small step for a Democrat, one giant leap for the Democratic Party. And so the response has just been overwhelming on our side. But I think the thing that is most encouraging is I've just been flooded with emails and direct messages on Instagram and TikTok and Facebook and Twitter where people are saying, I lean right or I hate both parties or I can't tell you how many people have sent me a message over the last week where they start off with, I have never messaged a politician before.
Right.
That is probably the most common thing I've heard over the
Which
last
is
week.
which is a good sign because
Right.
that's really
Yeah. I mean,
good. Yeah.
these are not people who listen to this show. They don't watch
Right.
MSNBC. And some of them even said, like, I didn't agree with everything that I heard, but I was struck by your openness and your honesty. And I was really interested in some of your thoughts about big money and corruption
Right.
and these billionaire mega donors. And so I don't know. It just it's been an avalanche, both on the Democratic side with people who are just kind of surprised that a Democrat went on this show and was able to connect. But then I think more importantly, from a lot of people who are not in a Democratic coalition, who are interested in in my views and interested in my values, and found places to connect. And connection is the name of the game in politics. That's the only thing that matters. Is are
Right.
you connecting with people? That's the only thing that moves people to do something, like show up to vote or change this system of ours.
Other Democrats do go on Rogan, like Bernie is a regular Rogan guest or has at least been 2 or 3 times. We've seen Ro Khanna on Rogan. Threading the needle when it comes to Democratic populism is not impossible, but we have not had big candidates do it, right? I mean,
Right.
like Ro Khanna and Bernie, it's a little bit different. So to have a sort of more centristy candidate trying to thread the populism needle is in some ways, I think, profound.
Yeah, and I have kind of a simple criteria when it comes to political communications, which is a big part of my job, right? I do a lot of legislative work. I pass a lot of bills, but my job also includes communicating with my constituents and with the broader public. And if you can't do that, you don't change public opinion, and you don't organize or inspire people to change the balance of power in a place like Texas. So communication is central to the job that I have. And when it comes to that communication, I just try to always be myself and tell the truth. Those are the two things that I go into these conversations with. Anything else, trying to figure out how to thread a needle or have a certain messaging or whatever, all that is just takes up too much space in my brain. And so it's just easier to just be myself, flaws included. And I think honestly, that's what people are hungry for. It's why I think people respond to Donald Trump. They don't agree with everything Donald Trump says either, but he
Right.
is himself,
Right.
flaws and all.
Right.
He is unabashed in
Yeah.
being
Right.
himself. And I do think we need elected officials in our coalition to do the same thing. Hopefully with more character and integrity and
Yeah.
honesty, and core values than Donald Trump. But you really shouldn't have that the consultant
Yeah.
poll driven filter that so many of us get trapped into as politicians. You
It's
can
the
kind of
worst.
see sometimes when
Yeah.
politicians are like buffering, right? Like you get asked a question and there's like some loading time where they're like
Yeah.
putting it through all these different layers. That's
So
not going to
bad.
cut it anymore. It really
Yeah.
isn't. That's not the world we live in anymore. Maybe it was in the 80s and the 90s.
But not
It's not
now.
the 2020s.
I wonder if you could talk about how you have this religious background and what that looks like and how that sort of
Yeah.
informs.
I mean,
Yeah.
I told you I try to be myself, and that includes my faith. And sometimes it makes people in our coalition uncomfortable. I mean, I've gotten some messages since Rogan saying like, "I don't think you should talk this much about religion as a public official." I've gotten
Everybody
some
has an
meaner
opinion.
I've gotten some meaner ones from our fellow progressives who are like, "I don't want to hear about your sky daddy." And I understand where that's coming from. People
I
have
like
been
Sky Daddy. I've
Yeah.
never heard of Sky Daddy.
Yeah, it's one way. It's one way to
Yeah.
describe religion.
Yeah.
We wonder why people of faith feel turned off by the Democratic
Yeah.
Party. But
Yeah.
I get where that's coming from because organized religion has done a lot of damage and it's hurt a lot of people. And so I understand it comes from a place of hurt and pain and I
Mm.
respect that very much. And I want to try to build that divide. But it does I have gotten pushback.
Yeah.
And again, I just say that for any elected officials or staffers or operatives who are listening to your show, you still have to be yourself, even if it's going to
Yeah.
ruffle some feathers, even if you're not going to be everybody's cup of tea, right?
Yeah.
But you have to be yourself. And for me, my faith is why I do this. I mean, it is the foundation of my life. My granddad was a Baptist preacher. I grew up in a Presbyterian church. It's still the same church I attend today. Um, it's why I went into public service. It's why I became a teacher. It's why I ran for office because I am called to love God and love neighbor. Those are the two commandments that
Right.
Jesus gave us as Christians. And they're pretty simple. I mean, they're not easy and they're very difficult sometimes to follow, but it is pretty simple. And we as Christians are called to move from the sanctuary where we love God, where we are in touch with our spiritual selves. We're called to move from that sanctuary to the streets where our neighbors are. We're called to feed the hungry and heal the sick and welcome the stranger. That is essential. I mean, Jesus tells us in the New Testament that is how we will be saved, right? Sometimes you hear the word saved and you think it means, professing some kind of faith or something. But
Right.
in Matthew 25, Jesus is very clear. The way you will be saved is how you treat the least of these.
Mm.
And that doesn't mean belonging to a church. My pastor growing up said, being in church doesn't make you a Christian, just like sitting in a garage doesn't make you a car, right?
Yeah.
So it is how you act out in the world. And honestly, I know a lot of non-religious people who are more Christ-like than a lot
Right.
of people who go to church every Sunday.
No,
But
for
but
sure.
that foundation of faith is why I do this work, and I can't help but explain that and talk about that. And I'm not going to be ashamed or afraid to say those things, even if it may ruffle some feathers in my own coalition.
One of the things that the right really wants is for centrist Democrats to throw trans children, to throw
Yes,
the LGBTQ under the bus.
right.
I strongly believe that it's nobody's goddamn business what adult people wanna do to their bodies.
Amen.
But that's just me as a reformed Jew. Tell me what your thinking is on this. I mean, I saw this video of a Democratic politician saying, "No, a man can't become a woman," and I thought, "Why is it any business of yours?"
No, and you may be a Reformed Jew who's not in Texas and you have that attitude. I know
Right.
there are a lot of Texas Protestants who have that same value of live and let live. There are a few things that make our state great. I'm an eighth generation Texan, so I love my state more than it's probably healthy to love a state. But there are kind of two values that define our state and have throughout our history. One is freedom. Texas, the reason it captures the country's imagination all the time is because it is in some ways a frontier, right? Not just physically or geographically, but artistically, politically, right? The Great Society came from Texas. Beyonce Knowles just came out with the most innovative country album we've ever seen. She's a Texan, right? Like we have constantly defined the frontier. We're the ones who put a man on the moon, right? I mean, Texas has always been about freedom and breaking through from what has been to what could be. And that value of freedom, of letting people live they want to live, is kind of essential to how Texans see the world. The other value is friendship. The word Texas comes from the Native American word for friend, from the Caddo Native American word for friend. And they didn't use that word to describe a friend in their own tribe. They used that word to describe a friend in a different tribe. In other words, I think a better translation is ally, right? Someone who's different from you,
Right.
but is your friend, is your ally across lines of difference. And that's what makes Texas so great is we're this big mashup of all these different people and cultures and ideas and food and music. We're this big melting pot. We're kind of America on steroids in Texas. And our elected leaders in recent years, certainly over the last 20 years, as these kind of right-wing extremists have taken over our state, they've forgotten those two values of freedom and friendship that have defined our state throughout our history. And so I think kind of getting back in touch with those values is really necessary if we're going to navigate some of these issues that are dividing us.
Such a good point. Thank you for joining us, James.
Yeah, well, it went fast. Thanks for having me, and I'd love to
I
come
hope
back. So
yes, definitely do,
yeah.
and I hope to see you soon.